From the German economic miracle to the devastating World War, from the recovery of national pride to the loss of national sovereignty. No political movement has given people so much to talk about in the 20th century as the turbulent National Socialist movement. From the ashes of a crippled Germany, a revolution arose that restored prosperity, racial pride, and lost patriotic feelings to the Germans. A work that would end in a whirlwind of violence and delusions that are still the subject of debate in the world today. To value truth above opinions and to learn the real lessons about history, it is necessary to approach these periods in the most objective and least biased way possible. Today we are going to learn about the lives of several leaders of National Socialist Germany who marked a turning point in the 20th century. This is Reynaldo Jose Carrillo Vilches, and this is the New Encyclopedia, and I invite you to give us great support by liking this video and leaving your comments, which we always read, by turning on notifications with the bell, subscribing to the channel, of course, and sharing this material with all your contacts on WhatsApp, on social media, and anywhere else. So, without anything else to add, let's start with today's story. Joseph Goebbels was born into a family of devout Catholic middle-class parents in the small town of Ried, south of Mönchengladbach in Germany. He was born on October 29, 1897 to a factory worker, accountant father, and a mother from a farming family. By that time, Germany had only been unified as a single nation-state, the German Empire, for 22 years under the leadership of Otto von Bismarck. In the 20th century, the brother states became a leading global economic, cultural, and Christian center. Well-behaved, Goebbels was the most outstanding student in both elementary and high school, and he was also very skilled at playing the piano. Lacking physical attractiveness, with chronic lung inflammation and a shorter leg from a bone infection. At an early age, his limp and physical frailty were compensated by extraordinary intelligence, a quick tongue, and a melodious voice. In high school, he wanted to join the First World War but was rejected due to his disability. He was helped by the Federation of Catholic Students, of which he was a member. He obtained a scholarship to study Germanistics, history, and philology at several German universities, earning a doctorate from the University of Heidelberg in 1921. It's important to note that just a few years before earning this doctorate, the German Empire collapsed after its World War I defeat and an internal communist revolution. The Treaty of Versailles forced Germany to reduce its army to a minimum, to give up important territories, many with a German population, and to pay extremely high economic reparations. Likewise, for their reconstruction and to begin paying these reparations, they were forced to take out loans with extremely high interest rates from international banks. Although the name of the German Empire was kept, a new constitution was approved based on foreign presidencies, which transformed Germany's political and military system into a parliamentary democracy. Thus began the period known as the Weimar Republic from 1918 to 1933, a period characterized by constant political upheaval, social decline, and a severe economic crisis. On the other hand, it is also necessary to put into context that there had long been conflict and debate in Germany regarding the place in that country of the members of the Hebrew religion, whose most common name we will avoid mentioning due to this platform's demonetization policies. The members of the Hebrew religious group had already been expelled at least 3 times from German territories between the 14th and 16th centuries, accused of being usurers and subversive to internal peace. In the 19th century, under Otto von Bismarck's rule, it was not uncommon to see almost all political factions referring to this group in a very critical or even derogatory way. It was a matter that was publicly debated, especially as members of that group gained more presence in key institutions of the country. The resentment against that Hebrew group existed long before the arrival of the National Socialists and during the post-World War I decline, it rose sharply due to those blaming them for the defeat and the country's internal revolutions. Returning to Joseph Goebbels. Once he graduated, he returned home with the dream of becoming a writer. After a job he hated as a stockbroker, he worked as a journalist without much success and as a private tutor. Since then, his articles already showed a sharp criticism of what they called soulless materialism and the modernist culture in which Germany was immersed. During this time, Goebbels was searching for an identity and also began to distance himself from the Catholic religion. He immersed himself in the works of Dostoevsky, Stuart Chamberlain, and Oswald Spengler, known for the decline of the West. He also read the socialist ideas that came before and after Marx. By 1923, he showed interest in the National Socialist German Workers' Party. This party was founded in 1920, and its genesis was in the groups of former soldiers who had united to fight against various communist revolutions that had unsuccessfully risen up in different regions of Germany. Defenders of an ethno-nationalism related to a kind of conservative socialism that dated back to the time of Otto von Bismarck, opposed to both capitalism and Marxism. The party caught the interest of Goebbels after the failed coup d'etat, led by a man named Adolf. Impressed by the party's platform and its leader's charisma, he officially joined in February 1925, and in a very short time, he began to stand out for his talent in combining words and political ideas, along with excellent oratory skills. Adolf manages to win the loyalty of Goebbels, who for a time was hesitant amid the internal leadership struggles of the party. By 1926, Goebbels is appointed as the district leader of the party. For Berlin, the Berlin metropolis was one of the party's weakest areas. But Goebbels quickly infused new dynamism into the section, taking control of the Sturmabteilung and the SS and emerging as a skilled organizer and public speaker. He had the challenging task of winning the support of the working masses, who were very inclined toward the Marxist left, while also seeking sympathy among the middle classes. At this stage in Berlin, Goebbels began to develop innovative techniques, not only in propaganda, but in political organization in general. He used to say that whoever conquers the streets conquers the masses, and whoever conquers the masses conquers the state. He organized small ceremonial marches with songs and flags and encouraged street clashes with communists to publicize the party. He innovated the design and the type of phrases used in pamphlets and posters. His speeches were very well planned and rehearsed, as was the entire staging. He founded his own newspaper and established a school for training in public speaking, understanding that above books and political or economic programs, people would follow above all preachers. Goebbels always used humor and sarcasm, skillfully making jokes about his opponents. When Chancellor Brüning refused to appear in the debate he had been challenged to, Goebbels debated in the auditorium against an empty chair with a photo of the Chancellor and a recording of his speeches, with a wit and irony that made the Berlin audience burst out laughing. In this way, Goebbels is the architect of the foundations that would allow the party to expand dramatically in the coming years. In parallel to all this, the Weimar Republic continued to decline. Inflation and unemployment were fierce while the banks demanded their debt payments on time. The political landscape was turbulent with the growth of Marxist groups, while the liberals, conservatives, and social democrats in power did not guarantee stability. Culture, the press, and art promoted vulgarity, vice, debauchery, and pornography. The German identity felt emasculated, having gone in just a few years from a vigorous empire to a degraded republic. Not a few Germans, among them Joseph Goebbels, viewed with suspicion and resentment the high presence of members of the Hebrew religion in the top positions of the communist, social democratic, and liberal parties, as well as in the main newspapers and film studios, in the lending banks, in the capitalist funds that bought German properties at devalued prices during the crisis, and among the leaders and drafters of the Weimar Constitution. It is in this context that an ethno-nationalist group like the National Socialist Party emerges, which exalted the German race and conceived of the nation as a mystical union of blood and soil, with the right to exclude those who were not part of that bond, directly targeting from its beginnings members of the Hebrew religion. The party's original program called for the unification of Germans to build a great Germany, with a series of political, economic, territorial, and social changes that can't be summarized. Goebbels was already becoming the great disseminator of National Socialist principles: love and diligence for the motherland, German racial unity, self-determination of the people and recovery of old German territories, an economy based on work and not on usury, exclusion of Jews and foreigners from all important positions within the nation, and their deportation from the territory if necessary, promotion and distribution of private property for the national good, freedom of worship, provided it aligns with Aryan race values, and a strong centralized state that ensures national well-being and oversees the nation's vital forces, in addition to the elimination of the Treaty of Versailles, among many other demands. Similarly, the movement blamed Marxism, materialism, liberalism, and capitalism for Germany's downfall, and as ideologies that had been created by members of the Hebrew religion foreign to the German people. Goebbels in 1928 wrote, I quote, "They are not creative, they don't produce anything, they only trade products. They have corrupted our race, our land, and our morals. When have you ever seen them working instead of looting, corrupting, and living off the sweat of others? This will change when we are truly Germans." End quote. While in Berlin, Goebbels made one final unsuccessful attempt to join the literary and theater scene. Politics was clearly his destiny, so much so that despite the numerous women he was with during this period, he rejected any kind of formal relationship that would interfere with his career. After conflicts and internal disputes, Goebbels is finally appointed in 1930 as the party's director of propaganda. This was the final consolidation of Goebbels as part of the National Socialist nomenclature. From there, he built an empire of over 120 newspapers nationwide, along with various propaganda and agitation mechanisms. Elected as a deputy in 1928, he sought as much controversy as possible in Parliament to gain media exposure. More than once, he had to appear before the courts due to defamation charges, but not without earning the applause of many people for his harsh criticism of the corrupt political class. His work also earned the party notable support from young people. Before taking power, they had already won nearly all the student federations nationwide. Around that time, he also met Magda, a divorced woman whom he would marry. Adolf would be the best man at the wedding. In the early 1930s, Germany's ruling coalition faltered amid economic chaos. In the 1932 elections, the National Socialists went from 12 seats to an astonishing 107 seats in parliament. Under Joseph Goebbels' leadership, the party's political, electoral, and propaganda organization gained unstoppable momentum. Months later, due to political instability, elections were held again and the National Socialists won 230 seats and 14 million votes. Meanwhile, street violence between political factions was rampant, with more than 100 deaths among the different sides. The president of the parliament, Hermann Göring, demanded that the government guarantee peace. Goebbels, in turn, had spent years building the image of an Adolf as the great leader that Germany needed to achieve unity, peace, and to rise from the ashes it had been in since the First World War. Finally, after achieving an alliance between the National Socialists and Conservatives, Adolf was appointed as Chancellor of Germany by President Hindenburg on January 30, 1933, in an attempt to stabilize the country. In this way, Adolf and his movement reached the most important position in the German state, amid a country economically devastated and near civil war. That same day, to celebrate this long-awaited moment, Goebbels organizes a torchlight parade through Berlin with 60,000 militants. A month after his appointment as chancellor, the famous Reichstag fire occurs, pointed out as an attempted communist insurrection. President Hindenburg and Adolf's cabinet issue the decree that suspends civil liberties and begins the de facto outlawing of the Communist Party. The following month, the parliament passes the so-called Enabling Act, which granted legislative powers to Chancellor Adolf. This marked the beginning of the end for the Weimar Parliamentary and Democratic Republic and the transition to a National Socialist dictatorial republic. Goebbels was a key player as the mastermind and executive manager behind the party's policy. Despite their anti-capitalist and anti-bourgeois rhetoric, the National Socialists received significant funding from major European companies and even from Wall Street magnates and international bankers, such as the Rockefellers. Over time, they toned down the anti-capitalist rhetoric to focus on anti-Marxist and anti-Jewish rhetoric. The German government began a process of penetrating and unifying all the active forces in the country through genuine persuasion or direct coercion. Business owners, banks, labor unions, civil associations, agricultural groups, schools, the media, and clubs of all kinds align themselves with the strategic goals of the National Socialist program. Many companies are also privatized, and there is an effort to replace the gold standard with the so-called labor standard, to issue money and thus take greater control of the country's finances. With strong state supervision and a policy of grouping corporations together, the German economy experiences exceptional results. The deficit and inflation drop substantially, industry and purchasing power grow, and unemployment disappears completely. On March 7, 1933, Adolf appoints Joseph Goebbels as Minister for Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, being the youngest in the cabinet at only 35 years old. From then on, a process of large-scale education and propaganda began, making use of all the media connected to cultural and intellectual life. At the same time, Goebbels was one of the minds who drafted the decrees and other communications from the Chancellery. Throughout all these years of government, Goebbels was the main architect of the direct and indirect supervision of the press, academia, cinema, art, music, and propaganda. He established effective government control over these areas using various methods, like grouping each media, artistic, or educational guild in different governmental subchambers that governed them. Goebbels dictated the main communication guidelines for the major media outlets. The National Socialists were also pioneers in the use of radio and cinema as means of mass propaganda. The government also begins a policy that, over the years, intensifies to marginalize, deport, and neutralize sectors of the population of Jewish origin, as well as other groups considered to be opposed to German interests, just as it represses thousands of dissidents who might compromise the stability that the regime had finally achieved. Goebbels also leads the action against the un-German spirit, which sought to restore patriotic values in academia and literature. The most memorable manifestation of this policy was the famous book burnings, where the works of authors like Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, Sigmund Freud, and many others were burned. According to the National Socialists, these authors promoted communism, atheism, vice, debauchery, and other ideologies that, in their view, had characterized the economic, moral, and political subversion of the Weimar Republic. The radio stations in all regions were supervised. Reich Broadcasting Society. The Reich Film Chamber regulated that films contrary to National Socialist morals were not broadcast. Germany's largest film studio was bought by the state. Authentic blockbuster fiction and documentary productions were made to promote the government's ideology, such as the epic documentary called Triumph of the Will, films that glorified the German past, or fiction movies that subtly promoted the eugenics programs carried out by the government. For the National Socialist government, German racial unity was above everything else, including God and religion. They were neither conservatives nor traditionalists. Goebbels, having abandoned his Catholic past, saw Christianity and National Socialism as irreconcilably opposed. This led some spokesmen of the German church to condemn racialism, ethnic persecution, and eugenics programs as contrary to moral law. Hundreds of priests, nuns, and religious laypeople were arrested, Catholic publications were neutralized, and crucifixes were removed from public buildings. Catholic education in schools was reduced, and during the war, convents and church properties were expropriated. Goebbels, among the most anti-clerical in the government, frequently accused the church of moral corruption in his speeches. However, the Führer ordered a reduction in hostilities against the church in 1937, while all kinds of hostilities against the population were beginning to intensify. Of Hebrew origin, it's very common for the phrase to be attributed to Goebbels that if you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, eventually people will believe it. However, to be truthful, there is not a single trace that this was his creation or that he ever said it at any time. Rather, he was a proponent that effective propaganda had to be accurate and based on the truth. Beyond that, in practice, he undoubtedly resorted to lies. Goebbels in 1934 said, I quote, "Good propaganda does not need lies. Believing people can't accept the truth is a mistake. It's about presenting it understandably," end quote. Numerous historians argue the information policy of Germany during the war managed to be superior to that of the Allies. In terms of the monolithic nature of the information and regarding which information was considered more credible and serious by the non-involved countries. After a period of relative peace and strong economic growth, caused by various factors that merit their own video, the truth is evident. And against the wishes of the majority of the European population, the main powers of the old continent began what would be remembered as the Second World War. The continent would sink into a sea of blood of millions of valuable Europeans, in which no power was left with its hands clean of serious crimes. On an internal level, the first years of the war were easy for Goebbels as Minister of Propaganda, since the German victories alone were enough to boost the morale of any German. On an external level, most mass media in the territories occupied by Germany also came under Goebbels' supervision. All information that was transmitted was more strictly controlled than ever, just as the other warring powers did. From music and cinema to the news that was now being broadcast in more than 53 languages. Adolf himself in the early years personally reviewed a special weekly newsreel that was required to be shown in every cinema program. Goebbels didn't hesitate to use any event during those years that he could exploit for communication purposes, such as the Katyn massacre perpetrated by the Soviets, the Poles, who at that time were allies. But Goebbels' real challenge came in the last 2 years of the war. As German troops suffered terrible defeats, cities were bombed relentlessly, and basic goods became scarce. It was during this dramatic period that Goebbels proved his skills as a mastermind at shaping public opinion. Historian Heiber writes that Goebbels managed to keep the population's hope, morale, and blind faith in their Führer until the very end. Despite intense suffering, the German people stayed loyal to Adolf's flag and maintained their faith. The supreme leader gradually reduced his public appearances and speeches, so the modest young man from the radio, named Goebbels, ended up becoming the main voice of the government for the German people. While his country drew global attention, his speech on February 18, 1943 at the Sports Palace, after the defeat at Stalingrad, is especially remembered for the emotional fervor it stirred in the audience. He said, "The nation is ready for anything. The Führer has given the order, and we will follow him. We have unshakable faith in victory. We see it before us. We only need to reach it and subordinate everything to it. People rise up and let the storm break," end quote. No ovation as loud and fanatical had followed Adolf's speeches before. At that time, the German economy was still functioning normally, and Goebbels was a proponent of the concept of total war, which the country had not yet embarked on. Goebbels was among the first officials to admit to Germans how serious the situation was and that defeat was possible. The Allies in the Soviet Union were advancing strongly. Mussolini had fallen, and German cities were being bombed daily. Goebbels suggested to Adolf that negotiating a ceasefire was responsible, but Adolf categorically rejected it. While other high-ranking National Socialist officials were starting to fall apart, Goebbels still dared to appear in public. In person and through his speeches before the masses, he restored their faith and hope. In addition to his propaganda work, Goebbels also had to take on organizational duties in 1944 as plenipotentiary for total war. He is responsible for ensuring that industry, energy, transportation, telecommunications, education, food, and fuel networks continue to function in Germany amid the chaos of war. But defeat was imminent. Millions of Germans were fleeing westward. Goebbels makes his last radio broadcast on April 19, 1945. Maintaining the usual eloquence and controlled passion, he acknowledges the seriousness but vows to fight to the end and die with his children, defending the capital city. Adolf dictates his last will and testament and appoints none other than Joseph Goebbels as the new Chancellor of the Reich. On April 30th, Adolf reportedly takes his own life. With him, the National Socialist adventure also came to an end at the end of Adolf Goebbels' testament. He writes that the only order from the Führer he would not obey was to flee Berlin as the new Chancellor, and that for reasons of humanity and loyalty, he would die with his wife and children at the Führer's side. Goebbels refused to join the high-ranking officials who were preparing to flee. He sends a message to Adolf's personal pilot that said, "Tell Dönitz that we are not only capable of living and fighting, but also of dying." Finally, with testimonies that vary in the details, Goebbels and his wife ended the lives of their children, and then took their own. From the ecstasy that raised Germany into a new power, only rubble and death remained. The last commander of the Berlin defensive area was now authorized to request unconditional surrender from the Soviets, thus ending the war earthquake that Europe had experienced for 4 years. The 20th century, the so-called century of progress and science, was also the century of the harshest wars, in the name of the new modern ideologies that replace God, in the name of democracy, communism, freedom, and nationalism. More people died in less time than in any other conflict in history. The German case is especially significant because, unlike movies about heroes versus villains, every tragedy doesn't have a justification, but it does have causes which are often simplified, trivialized, manipulated, or hidden. The human storm that had National Socialism among its main actors took shape in an industrious, disciplined, and proud people who had just been humiliated, impoverished, and bombed by cultural and political forms very different from their own. In Joseph Goebbels, they found the mastermind to exalt the deepest ambitions, the contained resentments, and the hidden pride of a German people who once again aspired to be at the top of the world. A politician and communicator par excellence, who mobilized the aspirations and resentments of an imperial nation toward an apotheotic ecstasy of national resurgence, which had, as its final result, millions of German bodies fallen in the fields and streets of Europe, and German sovereignty divided among the powers they sought to fight. Johanna Maria Magdalena Richel was born in Berlin on November 11, 1901. Her father was Oskar Richel, a prominent engineer who worked as a construction contractor. Her mother was Auguste Baron, a woman of just 20 years old who dedicated herself to maintaining the household. The parents were not married when Magda was conceived, and even after they got married, they would not stay together for long. So Magda Goebbels would grow up in a broken home due to her parents' divorce. Later, her mother would have a second marriage with the Jewish magnate Richard Friedlander, a successful businessman. Were both her biological father and her Jewish stepfather present in her life as father figures? During these years, the Germanic peoples had only been unified as the German nation-state for a few decades, and they were considered one of the most vigorous regions economically, artistically, and culturally, not only in Europe but in the world. Since neither of her parents had time to dedicate to her education, they decided to enroll Magda in the Ursuline convent, which was known at the time as one of the strictest girls' boarding schools in Europe. It was in this rigorous environment of learning and deep religious devotion that Magda would develop her strong discipline, which she would have for most of her life. During her stay at the convent, Magda became a popular girl among her classmates. Her precocious wit kept her from troubling those responsible for her education. She participated in the spiritual exercises with devotion and showed fervent faith throughout her stay. When she left the boarding school at the age of 8, she was remembered as an active and intelligent girl. In August 1914, after the outbreak of World War I, her family left Belgium to return to Germany. During these years, her family was forced to change their lifestyle due to the pressing economic situation caused by the war. These material shortages would plunge the young Magda into an early depression. Although her life at the boarding school had been humble and simple, Magda was unaccustomed to worries. Until then, she had grown up in luxury and, due to her father's good position, took it for granted. During the 4 years of the war, Magda attended night classes at Kolmorgen High School. During this stage of her youth, she first encountered Buddhism. Her biological father, despite having been a devout Catholic, began to feel attracted to Eastern religion, and he sparks that same interest in his daughter Magda. In his free time, he gave Magda books about Buddhism and discussed them with her, and so little by little her father turns her into a fervent disciple of the Buddha's teachings, displacing Catholicism. From this moment on, Buddhist literature would always accompany her by her bedside, and she would keep for the rest of her life the belief in a terrestrial rebirth, but purified after death. However, Buddhism would be an aspect of her life that she would only share with her closest social circle. These Eastern spiritual beliefs would play a role in the tragic outcome that the family would later experience. After years of battle in the First World War, Germany is humiliated after its defeat in the war. Internal revolutions caused the German Kaiser to abdicate and ended the monarchy there, and the Treaty of Versailles imposes very unfavorable economic and military conditions on the former German regional power. The period that would later be called the Weimar Republic was beginning. At 17 years old, Magda was already a girl who stood out not only for her physical attractiveness, but also for her level of culture. In general knowledge, she surpassed all her classmates and also showed a higher degree of maturity for her age. Her main friends were girls older than her and even teachers. She preferred to spend time with them rather than share her free time with women her own age and from her year. At home, she was an only child and never had friends her age, and both her stepfather and her biological father had treated her as an equal since childhood. However, Magda would make her definitive leap into adulthood at the most unexpected moment. In 1920, during a train trip, the young Magda, just 18 years old, would accidentally meet her first husband, the businessman Gunther Quandt, a German tycoon without much elegance or physical attractiveness, 20 years older than her. Soon after they start dating, Quandt proposes, and without thinking much about it, Magda accepts the proposal, becoming the young wife of one of the richest men in Germany. And in addition, she becomes the stepmother of the 2 children that this businessman had from a previous marriage. The news had been received with astonishment by Magda's circle. Everyone took it for granted that Magda was lucky for having secured the rest of her life by marrying the leader of a powerful industrial empire. However, soon after, LA's new husband begins to impose conditions to safeguard his wealth and his prestige. Quant demands that she convert to Protestantism and that she resume her biological father's surname. Magda didn't object at first. What seemed like a happy marriage with both parties satisfied begins to wither as problems start to arise between them. Magda, who had a special sensitivity for art, looked with disfavor at how her new husband appreciated beauty, not even the story. He was a successful businessman, devoted to the task of expanding his economic power and therefore lacked enough time to spend with Magda. Although their relationship was distant, they ended up having a child. But Magda not only had to take care of her new child, but also her 2 stepchildren and 3 more children who had been adopted by her husband. When he learned his friend had died, leaving his children orphaned, and she had to bear this enormous responsibility in addition to taking care of the house. Meanwhile, her husband lived in a different world, ignoring all of Magda's problems. Despite the opulent lifestyle, which allowed her to enjoy the status of her businessman husband, Magda was unhappy with the marriage and secretly wished to get a divorce. And then, after 9 long years of a cold relationship with Quant, Magda met a young man at a party with whom she would have an affair. With him, Magda would begin to enjoy all those romantic gestures that she never received from her husband. She traveled with her lover, staying in the priciest hotels, without worrying too much about hiding the love affair she was having behind her husband's back. However, when he noticed Magda's change in attitude, her husband hired a private detective who quickly discovered his wife's affair. In retaliation, Magda is permanently expelled from her husband's house and is forced to pack her whole life into a few suitcases. Despite the distress her husband suffers, Magda manages to sign a divorce agreement that is generous in financial terms, and she promises that she would never get married again in her life. Meanwhile, in Germany, the Weimar Republic was going through a tough period of economic crisis, unemployment, and moral decline. Meanwhile, more and more Germans looked with suspicion as many members of the Hebrew religion held a lot of leadership positions in this crisis-stricken Germany. In the midst of this, a party that promoted the ethnic and national unity of Germans and the return of former German greatness was gaining popularity among the people. Returning to Magda, her promise to never have a stable relationship again would last only a few months. By 1930, though never interested in politics, Magda attended a National Socialist Party meeting. There, she listens to the speech of a persuasive speaker who keeps her enthralled in her seat. She was fascinated by such eloquence, and she leaves so convinced of the party's ideals that a few days later, she joins as a member. Does Magda develop a deep interest in German politics? He was a short, thin man with broad culture and knowledge in history, philosophy, and art, and with great skill in politics and speech, which allowed him to rise quickly through the ranks of the National Socialist Party. His name was Joseph Goebbels. When the party director visits her to welcome her to the group, he offers Magda the position of leader of the National Women's Organization in a small town in the country. Without any objection or asking what her job would consist of, Magda accepts the offer. She had found a new interest and a new passion. To better understand the party's ideology, she buys a copy of the book Mein Kampf and reads it from beginning to end. She also starts following in the press all the speeches given by the main leaders of the party, and eager to get more seriously involved in the growth of the movement. She resigns from her secondary position and goes to one of the most important party headquarters in Berlin, seeking greater responsibility. There, Magda is hired as the secretary of a National Socialist politician. But shortly after, while she was going down some stairs in the offices, Joseph Goebbels, dressed in a trench coat, crosses her path and sets his eyes on her, attracted by her physical charm. This great orator, who had hypnotized Magda some time before, quickly approaches the reception to ask who that woman he had just crossed paths with was. And upon finding out who she was, he orders that she be introduced to him. When she finally sits down to talk with Goebbels, Magda tells him that the speech he gave some time ago was what motivated her to join the party. And Goebbels, fascinated by her beauty, but also by her level of education, he offers Magda a job as his secretary, which she accepts without hesitation. From then on, Magda would have her future husband's private files in her hands, and she would handle information about everything that happened within the party, as well as what was being said about it internationally. However, over time, the working relationship between them would turn into a more personal and close one. Goebbels began inviting Magda to private party meetings, attended social gatherings, at friends' houses with her, and discussed philosophy with her for long hours. The level of trust he felt for her even led him to invite her to his own home. Magda had found the place where she felt happy. Surrounded by all those personalities, she felt that she was recognized for her intellectual abilities, and not just for her physical beauty. But along with feeling fulfilled, her attraction to Joseph Goebbels grew quickly. She sat in front of Joseph Goebbels late into the night every day. Week after week, they worked more and more closely together, and soon Goebbels didn't make any important decisions without first consulting his secretary. Magda, his secretary, was no longer just his secretary, but a loyal confidant for whom he also felt romantic attraction. Finally, in 1931, Joseph and Magda began a romantic relationship, with plans to get married by the end of the year. However, there was an obstacle that crossed Magda's life which almost prevented the marriage from happening. Magda stayed friends with the lover she had betrayed her first husband with. He, however, was still secretly in love with Magda and held on to the hope of marrying her someday. When he found out from Magda herself that she was going to marry Joseph Goebbels, the man pulls out a revolver, points it at Magda, and shoots her in a fit of jealousy. The bullet hits near her, giving her time to escape and call the police. This altercation would only serve to deepen Magda's love for Goebbels and her commitment to the party. After the unpleasantness, Joseph and Magda, with Adolf as the best man, would get married in December 1931. This despite the almost unanimous disapproval of everyone in Magda's circle. In their early marriage, Magda devoted herself to household chores. At the same time, her position within the party kept growing. He was a collaborator and witness to the National Socialist Party's rise, where her husband was already a key figure. Meanwhile, in Germany, the economic situation and political unrest were becoming increasingly chaotic. The population sought an alternative to restore order. As a result, the National Socialist Party achieved a meteoric rise and won hundreds of seats in the German parliament. Finally, by 1933, after an agreement between the political establishment and economic power, the coalition of deputies from the National Socialist Party and the faction of deputies from the Conservative Party appoint the head of the National Socialist Party as the new Chancellor of Germany. A new era was beginning for the country. This momentous event would bring many changes to Magda's life. Her husband was no longer just a speaker known for his eloquence or a political agitator. Joseph Goebbels was now a state authority and would go on to serve as Minister for Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. And Magda also had to take on the consequences of such responsibility. Magda Goebbels and her husband were passionate, convinced, and proud of the National Socialist cause. Magda always acted committed to the ideals of the party and also enjoyed a good friendship with Adolf. Because of this, she would become one of the most important female faces in the entire government. Magda comes into the spotlight as the public face of the Women's League of the National Socialist Party, an organization tasked with promoting the party's ideology about women to the public. And in this propaganda work of the League, it reached millions of German women who were called to live according to the world view of the Third Reich, being patriotic women. with the great mission of raising future generations of strong and healthy German men, and to maintain the best possible home for the men who would be out building the new German empire. As the head of the National Socialist government, he had decided to present himself to the public as a single man. Magda begins to be regarded, with her constant exposure in the media, as a kind of First Lady of the Third Reich, even though she was the wife of a government minister and not the Chancellor. But this role wasn't just about propaganda. Being seen as the First Lady truly affected her life. Magda acted as the unofficial representative of the regime and received letters from women all over the country with questions about domestic matters, child custody issues, and other various topics. When was it necessary to optimize National Socialist propaganda around these values? The entire Goebbels family was taken by the propaganda machine as the example of the Aryan family that the rest of the families in Germany should follow. She is a mother and her children. They were photographed and filmed on multiple occasions, conveying a lifestyle associated with the ideal promoted by the family in the German government. However, at the same time, problems were also beginning within the marriage of Magda and Joseph. Both, exhausted by this situation, began to secretly have extramarital affairs with lovers involved in the public scene. For example, Magda has two lovers. First, an affair with Kurt Lüdecke, a wealthy party sympathizer who contributed to its funding. And then, in 1938, with Karl Henke, an important party official who had worked in the Ministry of Propaganda. And, for his part, Joseph Goebbels had a relationship with Lida Barova, a Czechoslovak actress who lived in Berlin, just a few blocks from Goebbels' house. This affair between the minister and the actress almost changed the fate of both of them, and even of the National Socialist government, because Goebbels, completely blinded by the passion of this new romance, intended to resign from his position as minister, leave politics, and end his marriage with Magda to go to Japan as an ambassador with his new lover, on the eve of the start of the Second World War. However, the Führer refuses to grant him his wish and demands that he put an end to his affair with the actress, to silence all the rumors that began to arise about the family that propaganda portrayed as ideal. Both Joseph and Magda were photographed together again to show the public that the problems had ceased. But the reality is that from then on, the marriage was never the same. Behind closed doors, the first 6 years of the National Socialist government, Germany is experiencing a major economic upturn, along with greater security and political stability, along with strong surveillance and political repression of the party's enemies. However, multiple factors, which deserve a separate video, ultimately lead England and France to declare war on Germany, thus beginning World War II. This new scenario would force Joseph Goebbels to redouble his propaganda efforts. Meanwhile, Magda, for her part, continues to appear to the public as the female leader within the party. And although the couple's relationship remains in a state of coldness, they stay together until the end of the war, following the Führer's instructions not to tarnish the public image of the government. With a divorce in their inner circle, putting aside their differences, they leave marital fights behind to focus on Germany's progress in the war. However, this does not prevent Goebbels from continuing to have affairs with other women in secret. After the outbreak of the war, Magda is forced to take on a new role within the propaganda ministry headed by her husband. In times of peace, she had been the mother devoted to her maternal responsibilities. But now, in times of war, she was portrayed as a woman devoted to caring for the soldiers' health, and as a strong mother who kept the home peaceful in the absence of the father who was fighting in the war. Likewise, she becomes a dedicated hostess at private social events and gets involved in programs dedicated to helping war widows. The Europeans fought a war fiercely and bravely, and in the German spirit, a sense of martyrdom grows. It was common to have the mentality of embracing death before falling into enemy hands. Joseph Goebbels plays a crucial role in raising the morale of the population during this period of war. In her private life, Magda kept her friendship with the Führer, whom she continued to greatly admire as she always had. However, with the first failures that Germany begins to suffer on the Eastern Front, Magda's opinion of Adolf starts to change. In 1942, while at a gathering with friends, a speech by Adolf played on the radio. Magda turns off the radio and exclaims, "My God, what a load of garbage." She later develops a similar view of Joseph Goebbels. Magda confides in a close friend of hers that Goebbels seemed to her to be one of the biggest scoundrels German politics has ever known. Resigned to living in an unhappy marriage with her husband, Magda had given up any hope of rekindling the lost love between them. She stopped arguing with her husband about his well-known infidelities in Berlin and faced the situation with humor. Her hopes of reviving her marriage with Goebbels were buried, along with her hopes for Germany's victory in the war. After 2 years of victory after victory for Germany, the involvement of the Soviet Union and later the United States sealed the fate of the siblings. Faced with such a horrific situation for the German people, Goebbels was one of the few German leaders who continued to face the public directly and managed to keep the morale of the population high. By 1944, uneasiness had taken over Magda's spirit because she was convinced that Germany would suffer an absolute defeat sooner rather than later. And that meant not only a defeat for Germany, but certain death for her, her husband, and their 6 children. This gigantic disappointment was compounded by severe depression and chronic pain in her face, which plunged her heart even deeper into sorrow. In these times of tribulation, her esoteric and Buddhist beliefs were her only comfort. Magda held on to her Buddhist faith, viewing reincarnation as her last hope for a future life free from pain and suffering. The last months of Magda's life were a time of agonizing suffering. For many weeks, she lay bedridden, listening on the radio as the entire Third Reich system collapsed with the new victories of the Allied side. Thousands of Germans were dying on the battlefield with no real chance of avoiding defeat. Meanwhile, the more fortunate ones were beginning to suffer the consequences of shortages in their homes. Ironically, her husband's love was her only comfort during this time. Though it once seemed impossible, and she lost hope near the end, the love between Magda and Joseph Goebbels was rekindled as strongly as at the start. Maybe being so close to death and defeat reminded them of what really mattered. However, this rekindled infatuation between them would last only a few weeks. The Allied troops were rapidly approaching Berlin, and the end of the Third Reich seemed near. As the Germans found themselves cornered, Goebbels broadcasted speeches on the radio, vowing that he would fight to the death, and that he and his family were willing to die with dignity, rather than face the humiliation of surrender. When the Red Army finally entered the capital, Goebbels' family moved to the Board Bunker, an underground shelter located beneath the garden of the Reich Chancellery. There, Magda spent her final hours with her family. But before making the final decision, she wrote a farewell letter to one of her sons, who was in Africa as a prisoner of war. In it, she writes the following: "The world that comes after the Führer and National Socialism is no longer worth living in, and therefore I am taking the children with me, because they are too good for the life that would follow, and a merciful God will understand me when I give them salvation." One day before the Führer and his wife allegedly ended their lives. In his will, the top German leader names Joseph Goebbels as his successor, but the Goebbels family would follow their leader to the grave. The next day, Magda prepares to end the lives of her children, and then take her own together with her husband. The version most widely shared by historians about the event holds that they ordered the doctor present to prepare 6 morphine injections to put the children to sleep. Once this was done, Magda put a cyanide capsule in each of her children's mouths and pressed their heads and jaws until they broke. Once they were poisoned, Magda approached Goebbels to do the same with him, firmly believing that she would be reincarnated in a new life. Although there is no certainty about the way they died, the truth is that they managed to avoid the humiliation of the Third Reich's defeat. In this way, the life of the First Lady of the German Third Reich and the Goebbels family came to an end. With them, the little that remained of the National Socialist project also finally died. Germany would be occupied by the Allies and lose its sovereignty. The Goebbels would not live to see the total surrender of the once glorious German army.